What if one of the most dangerous military shifts of the 21st century did not begin with tanks, fighter jets, or aircraft carriers, but with drones? While much of the world focused on conventional firepower, Iran was building something cheaper, harder to stop, and far more adaptable. A system of pressure built in the shadows, one capable of changing battlefields, expanding influence, and forcing stronger enemies to rethink the rules of war. Because this is not just the story of military technology, this is the story of how drones became one of Iran's most effective strategic weapons. For years, Iran faced a military reality stacked against it. Sanctions, isolation, limited access to advanced Western systems, and constant pressure from more powerful rivals created a serious strategic disadvantage. But instead of trying to compete symmetrically, Tehran chose another path. It invested in asymmetric warfare. It developed missiles, proxy networks, naval harassment tactics, and above all, drones. Not simply as surveillance tools, but as instruments of intimidation, reach, precision, and political pressure. What emerged was not just a weapons program, but a doctrine, a way to project power without matching the enemy plane for plane or ship for ship. A way to strike, signal, exhaust, and destabilize with plausible deniability and lower cost. In this video, we are going to break down how Iran transformed UAVs into a central pillar of its military strategy, why these systems became so effective, and how they helped reshape the logic of modern conflict across the Middle East and beyond. Iran did not build its drone strategy from a position of strength. It built it from constraint. For decades, the country lived under sanctions, military embargoes, and the constant threat of confrontation with rivals that possessed more advanced air forces, better surveillance, deeper logistical networks, and stronger alliances. In a conventional war, that imbalance mattered. Iran knew it could not win by copying the military model of the United States, Israel, or the Gulf monarchies backed by Western systems. Trying to match them jet for jet would have been a losing game from the start, so Tehran looked for another route. Instead of asking how to dominate the battlefield in the traditional sense, Iranian planners asked a more dangerous question. How do you impose cost on a stronger enemy without fighting on their terms? That question became the foundation of a broader doctrine of asymmetric warfare, one built on patience, deniability, mobility, and psychological pressure. This is where drones stopped being secondary tools and started becoming strategic assets. At first, UAVs offered something simple but valuable: eyes in the sky. In hostile environments, that already mattered. Surveillance drones could monitor troop movement, map terrain, observe naval activity, and feed commanders real-time information without risking pilots. But Iran did not stop at reconnaissance. It understood something many powers learned more slowly. Once drones become cheap enough, scalable enough, and accurate enough, they stop being support systems and start becoming instruments of coercion. That shift changed everything, because a drone is not just a machine. In military terms, it is a message. It can watch without warning, strike without direct attribution, and appear in places where a conventional air force would be politically or operationally exposed. It can be launched at lower cost, produced in larger numbers, and used in ways that stretch enemy defenses over time. Against stronger powers, that matters more than prestige. It creates pressure, it forces reaction, it drains resources, and Iran began to build an entire operational mindset around that logic. Its drone program was not designed merely to destroy targets. It was designed to expand options, to give commanders tools that could harass shipping lanes, support proxy groups, hit infrastructure, test air defenses, shape regional escalation, and signal capability without crossing immediately into full-scale war. That made UAVs useful not only in battle, but in deterrence, intimidation, and influence. In other words, Iran found in drone something every constrained military power searches for: a weapon system that could punch above its weight. And once it proved that these platforms could survive, strike, and spread fear far beyond their cost, the balance of perception began to shift. Because now the question was no longer whether Iran had advanced aircraft. The question was how far its drones could reach. To understand why Iran's drones became so effective, you have to look beyond the aircraft themselves. This was never just about building flying machines. It was about building a system that could exploit weakness, multiply pressure, and bypass the strengths of more powerful militaries. A fighter jet demands air bases, expensive maintenance, trained pilots, spare parts, and a level of air superiority Iran could not reliably guarantee. A drone, by comparison, offered something far more practical, lower cost, lower risk, simpler deployment, and far more room for experimentation. If one was shot down, the political cost was limited. If one hit its target, the strategic message was enormous. That trade-off made drones ideal for Iran's way of war. They could be used directly by Iranian forces, but they were also perfect for a second layer of strategy, networked influence. Iran did not think only in terms of national firepower. It thought in terms of distributed pressure. Militias, allied factions, regional partners, and proxy forces could all become part of a wider military ecosystem. And drones fit into that system with dangerous efficiency. Why? Because they are transferable. A missile program is harder to hide, harder to move, and harder to delegate. A drone program can be adapted, copied, assembled, modified, and deployed across multiple fronts. That meant Iran was not just creating weapons for itself. It was helping create an entire style of conflict where pressure could emerge from different directions at once, often below the threshold of open war. That is what made the model so unsettling. An enemy was no longer facing one centralized air force. It was facing a growing web of aerial threats, surveillance drones, loitering munitions, one-way attack drones, and systems designed not necessarily to win a battle instantly, but to exhaust defenses, create uncertainty, and force constant vigilance. Even a limited strike could have an outsized effect if it exposed a vulnerability, disrupted infrastructure, or sent a signal that nowhere was fully secure. And that is where military doctrine meets psychology, because the true power of these drones was not always in the size of the explosion. It was in the tension they created before impact, the radar operator scanning the sky, the commander unsure whether the incoming object was a decoy, a surveillance platform, or a weapon. The government forced to respond to a low-cost threat with high-cost defensive systems. That imbalance is one of the most powerful features of asymmetric warfare. Iran understood that every interception still carried a price. Every alert drained attention. Every deployment consumed money. Every successful penetration damaged confidence, and once drones started proving they could travel long distances, evade detection in certain conditions, and strike sensitive targets with plausible deniability hanging in the background, they stopped looking like improvised tools of harassment. They started to look like a doctrine mature enough to challenge the logic of conventional superiority itself. Because now Iran was not merely compensating for weakness, it was turning weakness into a method. But no military doctrine becomes truly dangerous until it is tested under pressure, and Iran's drone strategy was not shaped in theory rooms alone. It evolved through real conflict zones, contested airspace, covert operations, proxy warfare, and repeated confrontation with enemies that were technologically superior but strategically overstretched. This was the proving ground. In these environments, drones gave Iran something few weapons could offer at the same time: reach, deniability, persistence, and flexibility. They could scout targets, follow movement patterns, support artillery logic, strike fixed infrastructure, and create just enough ambiguity to complicate direct retaliation. That ambiguity mattered. In modern conflict, the side that controls escalation often gains more than the side that simply fires first. Iran learned how to use drones inside that gray zone, not always as the weapon that ends the fight, but as the weapon that shapes the conditions of the fight. A drone can appear before a missile strike. It can assess damage after an attack. It can pressure an enemy into activating defenses, revealing radar positions, burning expensive interceptors, and exposing gaps in coverage. In that sense, the drone becomes more than an offensive platform. It becomes part of an intelligence cycle, a psychological operation, and a strategic trap. And that is where the doctrine grows sharper, because once drones are integrated into a broader military architecture, they start working as force multipliers. They help connect reconnaissance to strike capability. They extend the eyes of commanders beyond immediate front lines. They allow a state or its partners to threaten energy sites, shipping routes, military installations, and political symbols without relying on a conventional air campaign. That changes how power is projected. Iran did not need to dominate the skies in the traditional sense if it could make the skies feel permanently contested. It did not need to defeat stronger enemies enemies in a clean head-to-head confrontation if it could make every position, every convoy, every base, and every critical facility feel vulnerable. In war, vulnerability changes behavior. It slows decisions. It increases caution. And caution, when imposed on an opponent, is a form of control. This is why the drone program became larger than technology. It became a language of pressure, a way to signal reach without full mobilization. A way to support allies without deploying massive formations. A way to test responses, escalate carefully, or strike with enough force to create headlines without always triggering total war. And in a region already saturated with tension, that kind of tool becomes incredibly powerful because the battlefield is no longer just physical, it is also political, economic, psychological, symbolic. And the more Iran proved that its drones could operate across those layers at once, the more the world had to accept a hard reality. This was no longer a secondary capability built by a sanctioned state trying to compensate for its limitations. It was becoming one of the most effective pillars of its military influence. The next question was even more serious. What happens when a low-cost weapon starts reshaping the decisions of high-cost powers? What made Iran's drone doctrine truly disruptive was not just that it worked. It was that it forced stronger militaries into an uncomfortable equation. Every time a relatively inexpensive drone threatened a refinery, a military base, a radar site, or a shipping corridor, the response often required far more expensive systems to stop it. Surface-to-air missiles, advanced radar networks, combat air patrols, electronic warfare coverage, constant monitoring, and layered defense postures all had to stay active. That is the hidden battlefield of modern militarism, not just destruction, but cost imposition, and Iran understood that better than many expected. A state under sanctions does not need the perfect weapon, it needs the efficient weapon, the weapon that creates anxiety disproportionate to its production costs, the weapon that can be launched again and again until the enemy is forced to spend more defending than the attacker spends threatening. Once that cycle begins, the battlefield shifts from firepower alone to sustainability, patience, and strategic endurance. That is where drones become dangerous in a completely different way, because over time, they do not just attack targets, they attack confidence. They make military planners ask whether every vulnerable site is truly protected. They make governments realize that prestige platforms and elite air forces do not automatically solve the problem of persistent low-cost aerial threats. They expose a brutal truth of 21st century conflict. Superiority can be eroded not only by stronger weapons, but by smarter pressure. And Iran used that pressure in layers. One layer was physical, real strike capability against real targets. Another was strategic, forcing adversaries to widen their defensive posture. Another was psychological, creating a constant sense that escalation could come from above. With little warning and from unexpected directions. That layered effect is what turned drones from tactical assets into tools of geopolitical leverage. Because once a country proves it can threaten energy infrastructure, maritime movement, forward operating positions, or politically sensitive installations through indirect and flexible means, it gains influence beyond the battlefield. It enters negotiations differently, it signals differently, it deters differently. Even when it does not fire, the possibility that it could becomes part of the regional balance. And that may be the most important military lesson of all. Iran did not need drones to replace tanks, ships, missiles, or proxy warfare. It needed them to connect all those forms of pressure into one adaptable doctrine. A doctrine built not around symmetry, but around disruption. Not around matching the enemy system for system, but around forcing the enemy to defend too many systems at once. That is when the drone stops being a tool. It becomes a strategic language of power, and once that language is understood, the implications go far beyond Iran itself, because any state, militia, or armed movement watching closely can see the same lesson unfold in real time. In modern war, the side with fewer resources can still rewrite the rules if it finds the right pressure point. The real danger was never just the drone in the sky, it was the doctrine behind it. And that is why Iran's drone war matters far beyond one country, one region, or one battlefield. What began as a response to weakness evolved into a model of strategic adaptation. Iran looked at its disadvantages, sanctions, isolation, limited conventional reach, stronger enemies, and turned those constraints into a doctrine built on affordability, ambiguity, persistence, and pressure. That is what made its drone program more than a military project. It made it a lesson in how modern power can be built outside the old rules. Because the future of war is no longer defined only by who has the biggest fleet, the most advanced jets, or the largest defense budget. It is increasingly shaped by who can sustain pressure, stretch enemy defenses, create uncertainty, and force costly reactions over time. And in that environment, drones are not just supporting the battlefield, they are transforming it quietly, relentlessly, and in some cases, permanently. Iran understood that before many others did. It saw that a low-cost platform used with discipline and strategic intent could influence regional calculations, strengthen proxy networks, challenge advanced defense systems, and project power without needing total air superiority. That is a profound military shift. Not because drones are invincible, but because they are changing what effective force looks like in the first place. And that is the real story here. Not simply that Iran built drones, but that it helped prove a new reality of militarism in the 21st century. The balance of power can be shaken by weapons that are cheaper, smaller, harder to predict, and deeply integrated into asymmetric strategy. In that kind of war, dominance is no longer just about overwhelming force. It is about sustained pressure, and once that pressure becomes doctrine, the battlefield changes for everyone. So when we look at Iran's drone strategy, we are not just looking at one country's military evolution, we are looking at a warning. A preview of how future conflicts may spread, escalate, and endure. Not always through massive invasions, but through persistent systems designed to wear down stronger powers from the edges inward. That is what makes this story so important, because in the age of drone warfare, the most dangerous weapon may not be the one that explodes the hardest. It may be the one that forces the world to fight on entirely new terms. If you found this breakdown valuable, leave a like, comment with your view on the future of drone warfare, and subscribe for more cinematic military analysis.